All right, guys. Welcome to episode 3. In this episode, I'm going to be going over how I prep my brass. And the things that are required and the process that I found that produce the best results. So, this is going to be a 2-part episode. In this first episode, I'm going to show you my process on how I prep fired brass first. Uh, I figure this will be the most common scenario. Most guys are definitely going to work with fired brass at some point, if not right away, if they're working with range brass or brass that they picked up online or something that's once fired brass or any of that kind of scenario. So I figure to start out with in episode 1 or part 1 of episode 3 here, I'll just go ahead and cover fired brass. Anyways, I'm going to start with 20 cases of 308 brass here that I've just that I fired last out of a 100 round batch that I loaded up, and I'm just going to use those for my example here. They're Winchesters, and these are once fired. They were brand new before, and I'll show you in my part 2 episode here how I prepped those the first time. Um, Before I start, though, I do want to kind of give you a little disclaimer here that if you are working with some once fired brass, you need to make sure that if it's the primer pockets are crimped, like if they're military brass, Lake City, or even some like the Hornady taps and the whitetail classic stuff that they have, they crimp the primers in them. So if you need to take your cases, flip them over, look at the primer pocket. If you see any little indentations around it or a ring around it, that's indicative of a crimp, and you will need to remove that. Like I covered in my tools episode, I use the Super Swage 600 over here, if it's on the screen, whatever. But anyways, I use that to remove the this crimps, swage them out. You can use whatever method you want. Again, you can go back to that episode and see where I cover that. But anyways, if you have crimps, obviously you're going to need to remove those crimps before you go seating a new primer in. And I just wanted to be sure I mentioned that because I'm working with uncrimped brass here, so I'm not going to show that process in this video. I'm just going to kind of try to go off my notes here just so I don't skip any steps. So I apologize if I'm pausing here and you can tell that I'm obviously kind of reading some stuff here. So I apologize for that. I just want to make sure I'm getting all the info out. Anyways, starting out with some the brass that I have here, I've kind of worked it down to basically 10 steps that I've written it down to. It's less than 10 steps actual working, but anyways, I'm just going to read off these steps and then I'll go ahead and show you those steps. So step 1 is to decap, punch out all the spent primers. And then after that, we would normally wet tumble. I'm not going to cover that in this video because like I said in my previous video, there's lots of videos out there on wet tumbling. So to kind of keep this series more purposeful and short, I'm not going to cover wet tumbling. If you want to see that, look it up. There's videos out there. But anyways, after I decap, that's my next step is I wet tumble them to clean out all the carbon. Excuse me, especially out of the primer pockets. So after they're wet tumbled, I will dry them. I use an old food dehydrator to dry them out. It works awesome. But you just need to make sure they're dry before you mess with them because you don't want any water in there mixing with anything. I mean, absolutely, especially before you start priming and putting any powder in them, they must be dry. You can't have a drop of water in any of them. So once they're dry, then we'll go ahead and give them a fresh anneal. And then after annealing, we'll lube them up. Then we'll run them through our full length sizer without the expander ball. And then after that, we'll expand the necks with a mandrel to provide our final neck tension. And then after they're all sized, we'll run them through a dry tumbler, which I'm not going to show that either. But the dry tumbler with some corn cob, let them run overnight while you're sleeping. That'll take all the lube off of them and give you some nice, clean, ready to go cases to work with after that. And after I get all the lube off, that's when I go to my next step, which is trimming, chamfering, deburring. So that way I'm not working with lubed up cases that I'm trying to hold while it's cutting. So, and then once they're trimmed, chamfered, and deburred, they're pretty much done. At that point, if they're already fired and I've already sorted them before, I'll keep them in the same batch that they came from. If they're new cases to me and I don't know their weights and that kind of stuff, then I will sort them by weight at that point, and to try to keep them in groups and batches by weight, and by that I'm trying to keep all the internal volumes hopefully the same. So you can kind of do that how you want. It's another common method to do that by using water and weighing all the brass beforehand, and then filling them with water, weighing them again with water, and then looking at the difference there to determine the actual internal case capacity, and then sorting them that way. So that's going to provide you with more consistent pressures and more consistent muzzle velocity, which is obviously what we're after when we're going for precision ammo. So I've found that just sorting them by weight has worked for me. It's a little bit faster than messing with the water and then having to obviously dry them out again before I can mess with them again. So, but that's on you how you want to do it. So anyways, after we do all that process, here's another disclaimer for you, that if you find anything weird, any weird anomalies, something just isn't like the other when you're sizing, then you need to take that weird one and kind of set it off to the side, and you know, if it's still usable, use it for maybe your fowlers, ciders, things like that, something like that. But don't include that in the batch with the rest of them, because if something was weird, then it's probably going to reflect as well on target. And if you're using those for when it really counts, long range hunting and stuff like that, I mean, even competition shooting, it would suck to have that weird one that you're like, that was weird, oh well, and then something crazy happens out in the field, competition shooting, you blow your score, or you're out hunting and you miss or injure an animal instead of kill it. That would suck. So if you get any weird anomalies like that, it's best to just set that weird one off to the side. So, all right, with that taken care of, we will move on and get started here. So like I said, step one is to decap. If you notice here, I'm running a new press that I just got. In my other episode, I talked about how I wanted a new turret press, and well, I got one. So I'm going to use that in this video here. It's going to make it really nice to show you. So I've got all my 20 cases here, and we'll just go ahead and punch out all the primers and go on here. So this is the Lee Universal decapping die that I talked about before, so it makes it really nice. I don't have to lube the cases since it's not touching the cases. It's just simply going through here and punching out the primers. So it makes it quite easy for this step without having to worry about lube just yet, because our next step is going to be annealing. And obviously if we have lube on and we anneal, the annealer is going to burn off that lube, and then we've kind of wasted some lube essentially. So this makes it nice. And well, actually, let me back up here while I'm talking and working. Your next step is actually to wet tumble. So, and that's why we're punching the primers out before we wet tumble, is so that we can get our primers nice and clean, our primer pockets that is, nice and clean, and get all that carbon out of there so that our new primers seat in there really nice and consistency and consistent, because it is all about consistency, and we want our primers to ignite the powder in the same manner, same way every time. So having those cleaned out is pretty important. And instead of running a primer pocket like brush or whatever in there and cleaning them out, you can just use wet tumbling, let the stainless steel media clean those out for you while it's cleaning the rest of the case. It makes it really nice. But since I'm not going to be loading these in this video, I'm not worried about that. So we'll skip that step like I said. So everything's punched out. All the primers are punched out. That was pretty quick. And now we're ready for our next step, which is to anneal. So I'm going to set these over here. And this is my new annealer here. It's an induction annealer. This is an Annie. And so I built a little table here for it. And anyways, I've already got this set up. It runs off of a timer, and then I adjust the height. I've got it sitting on a scissor jack, and I can adjust the height easily of the machine and the coil. And this is my test case that I've used. I used some Tempolac to set the time of the induction, and then I marked a little mark on there to where the height is. So I set it in my little table that I made here, and just kind of looked right down here where the bottom of the coil is, and I just adjust that until I can just see that line, and then I know that my height of my coil is set right. And then I wrote on here the time, 1.1 seconds, and we'll flip this on here, and it's already still set from 1.1 from the last time when I set that up. And then we'll just go ahead and show you how that works here. Set that in, press go on the trap door, drop them down in the pan, and we'll go ahead and anneal all 20 of these. Show you how quick and easy that is with this machine. As you can see, unlike your torch annealers, like the annealers that I used before this one, this one was off and just sitting here. I mean, yeah, I do have it kind of pre-set up. But as you can see how when I wrote on that test case there, it makes it easy so that it would take me maybe 10 seconds to adjust this thing and get it set up to use if I didn't have it already pre-set up for the video. And that makes it extremely easy. And it's way faster than trying to set up the nozzle on the torch and make sure you've got a full tank of propane, and so your pressure coming out of that thing is the same. And you can just set this up and just fly through here like I'm doing pretty dang quick, even without an auto feeder. Takes really no time. The kids even love annealing on this thing. So that's done. I'll go ahead and feel that. It's not even warm. The water going through the tube is a little warm, but it's not warm enough that I'm afraid to turn that thing off without letting it cool any further. So 20 cases annealed just like that. Pretty awesome. So next we'll obviously these will need to cool a little bit. So I'm going to pause the video while those cool, and then we'll move on. All right, now that all the cases are cooled off, I've got them back in my loading block here, and the next step is to lube them up. So I'm using my lanolin and alcohol here, and we're just going to spray the outsides pretty good here, and make sure we get the insides too, so that way when we run through our mandrel, the inside's nice and lubed up too, and we're getting a good sizing without any big resistance on there. So just give her some sprays. Doesn't need to be crazy. Just want to make sure there's a good coating so nothing gets stuck. And then we'll spray down the tops there just to make sure that the insides are getting lubed up. So we'll kind of fan that a little bit just to make sure that alcohol gets dried off. It doesn't need to be 100% dry. I've ran these still pretty wet before, and I've never had a stuck case, so I'm not too worried about it. All right, so now that those are done, we'll flip this over here to our Lee full-length sizing die. Excuse me, I had to think over a second. It's a full-length sizing die with our expander ball removed, And this is going to size down our brass here after we just annealed it. It's going to make sure that all the work hardening is removed from the brass, and when we size them, it's going to bump those shoulders down and keep things nice and consistent, and size all our shoulders to a very consistent size, for lack of a better term, and make sure that our internal capacity on each case is the same that way, because our shoulders are bumped back nice and consistently and uniformly, and it's going to undersize or oversize rather the necks, so that way when we open them up with our expand mandrel, it's opening them back up and leaving them right exactly where we want on the our final tension to give us our nice consistent amount of tension on the bullet. So we'll go ahead and run all 20 of these through our sizing die here, squeeze them back down, and we'll move on here. See, this press is working out pretty nice. Definitely liking it so far. That would happen with any press. This lanolin lube is really nice, but it is sticky, and that's what's happened there. Is I wanted to stay stuck to my finger there. So something I kind of want to touch on here real quick that I realized that I didn't make sure that I talked about was setting up these dies. So setting up your sizing die, for those that may not know, if you kind of notice here, I'm having what's called a cam over when I get to the top. When you set this die up, you want to put your ram all the way up. Do one more here real quick and then I'll show you. So you want to run your ram all the way up, screw your die all the way until it touches your shell holder, and then run your ram back down, run it on there at least full turn, and run it up again until you can kind of feel it want to stop, and then you can push it just a little bit more, feel it kind of give there, and that'll ensure that when there's a case in there and you run it up, that the entire case is going into that die, and there's no daylight, no space at all between that shell holder and the bottom of your die. That will make sure that every single case is going into that die the exact same amount and getting sized exactly the same as the other one. If you've got any gaps in there, I'll guarantee you your brass is not going to get sized all the same. Some are going to be bumped a little bit more than others. And when you're in the game of consistency, you're obviously not getting consistent results that way. So I prefer cam over, and if your press can't cam over, if it's designed so it won't, then you just need to make sure that there is no daylight when you're all the way up with a case in there. So that way you ensure every single one is getting sized the same. All right, so now that they're all full length sized, we will move to our next step, which is the mandrel. So this is actually right here, if you kind of see this, it might look familiar to you. That's just a regular Lee full length, or not Lee full length, a Lee seating die, just a regular Lee seating die. And I had a buddy of mine that was awesome enough to make me some mandrels himself, turn these, and these actually go in place of your seating stem cup in your Lee die, seating die there. Take the cup out, put this in, and run it. So I have a mandrel that he cut me that gives me exactly 3/1000 of an inch tension, which is what I've found is exactly what I need to give me the tension that I want for my low SD ESs for this particular load with this particular brass. So you can use a K&M, that's what this one is over here. is a K&M. I have a K&M that'll work, but this thing's nice where it sits up. If you get a window riser, this will sit up and you can run the ram all the way down and not have to worry about it smashing and bottoming out. I use this one right here that's in here. I'll show you in part 2. This is my expand mandrel to open up my necks to my neck turner pilot. So, but this is what I use to set my final tension for my 308 cases. So that's the next step. And we'll go ahead and run those through. And for those that don't know, maybe like why I use my mandrel and I don't use the expander ball, is I have found that an expander ball will sometimes, when it's exiting the case, it will grab the shoulder or will grab the neck as soon as it starts to come out and start pulling on it. It'll meet resistance and it'll pull on it as it's coming back out, like I'm doing right now. We're going back out, and it ends up tending to stretch the neck and stretch out your shoulders as it exits. And so then while we were worried about our shoulders getting bumped back so that our internal capacity stays consistent, well, we're not getting that, obviously, if we're stretching our shoulders back out. And not all of them will do it, and some do, some don't. And obviously that's some do, some don't. That's inconsistent. And we've already discussed how important consistency is, so I've switched to a mandrel that sizes. Obviously it just comes as soon as it makes contact there, it's entering the case and pushing down and opening it up. And then as it's coming back out, it's just sliding back out. It's not stretching anything. So as long as it's lubed up, there's no real crazy amount of resistance there. It's not sizing it as it exits, where it would if it was in our full-length sizing die. It's sizing it as it exits, and it's pulling on it and stretching it out. So I mean, these do obviously size as it goes in, so you might think that it would push them down, but I have tested that with my headspace comparator set, and I've never seen that where it pushes it down, especially if they're properly lubed. It just provides you a much more uniform amount of neck tension, and way better than an expander ball. And when I get done here, I'm going to go back to my notes and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So there they all are. They're all sized, and so here we go, back to my notes. I want to talk, go back a little bit here, and I'll talk about annealing. So the reason why we anneal, why it's important, is because as you fire the brass and size it, you're work hardening the brass. So anytime, once the brass gets fired and it opens up, and then you squeeze it back down, anytime you're sizing and working with it, that process will start to harden the metal. So, and as you, as the hardness increases, the brass will become more and more brittle. So eventually you'll start seeing cracking and splitting around the necks because of that brittleness. Another reason, or another thing that'll happen, and is why I actually anneal, is because that as that hardness increases, the amount of spring back in the middle will also increase. So, and that's going to result in your neck tension getting increasingly less, because as the brass gets harder, spring back tension gets more, just gets more, and it'll spring back obviously more. Once you size it, it'll just spring right back to almost where it was. So your neck tension is going to get increasingly less and less. And when you have less neck tension, and especially when they're inconsistent from one another, which it's going to be, your muzzle velocities are going to be inconsistent. So we already know that that's not good. So annealing undoes that work hardening, and it provides us with very consistent sizing. The spring tension or the spring back on all the cases is going to be the same. The hardness is going to be the same if it's done properly. So it's one of the reasons why I switched to an induction annealer, because it's a little more superior type of anneal, and gives me definitely a more superior anneal to the brass, that I can count on a little bit more than torch. Torch obviously works fine. It's just a little more finicky to kind of work with and mess with. So, but it's definitely cheaper. So if you're just starting out, torch annealing is the way to go, because this well, it's awesome. It's not cheap. So, anyways, that's why we anneal. So then let's talk about the mandrel a little bit more. I kind of did talk about it and why I use it, but try to touch on it here just a little bit more. So bear with me as I kind of go through my notes here. So obviously, another popular method that would work similarly to a mandrel is using a bushing, or a bushing die rather. So I've used bushing dies before, and they do work great, and while they do indeed produce great results, I've come to conclude from my own experimenting that the full-length die without the expander and a mandrel produces actually better results. So I think maybe I've touched on another video about how I do have one of those nice expensive Redding die sets. It's like $775, $300, whatever it is, die set. That comes with a bushing neck sizing die, a body die, and then the competition seating die. The seating die is all I use. That's what this guy is. Out of that kit anymore, because I found that full length sizing die and that with the mandrel produces better results, and it's pushing those inconsistencies, if there are any inconsistencies in the thickness of your necks, pushing it to the outside diameter where it doesn't really matter so much, and giving you a nice uniform, even surface for your bullet to go into, and provides very uniform tension on that bullet because of that. So annealing obviously will help as well with that uniform tension. So another good thing that's about the full length sizing die without the expander ball and the mandrel is it's cheap. I mean, that Lee sizing die, obviously, I think anybody knows that Lee is known for being cheap. So obviously that is going to work really well. Take the expander ball out, and it's sizing, full length sizing just fine. It's not an inferior sizing from another die at that point. It's just your full length sizing, so it does fine. Then you switch over to a mandrel and you open your necks back up, giving you that nice uniform without stretching out the necks sizing on your necks. So unlike a bushing, where a bushing sizes from the outside, and if there are inconsistencies on your neck, it's going to squeeze those to the inside diameter. And I know some guys will say that, well, it's not a big deal because your bullet is basically acting like a mandrel as you seat it, and it's going to push those inconsistencies right back out. Yeah, I can kind of agree with that, but at the same time, a lead core, thin copper jacketed bullet is obviously way softer than a chunk of steel, which is a mandrel. So it might push it out a little bit, but it's not going to push it out the same way as steel would. So I would think that it's still an inferior. If you're planning on using your bullet as a mandrel, it's not going to really work quite like you want. I mean, we might be talking splitting hairs here on your real differences, but in my mind, the way my mind works, I'm after every little consistency and things that make sense to me, and it makes sense more to me to use a mandrel, steel mandrel, for sizing my necks than it does using a bushing and then expecting my bullet to act like the mandrel. So that's why I prefer a mandrel. And if you're going to turn necks, which I do, but if you're going to turn necks, a bushing can work because you're removing those inconsistencies. You're using a mandrel to push them out to the outside, So that's another reason why I think a mandrel does a good job, because you are using a mandrel when you neck turn to push them on the outside. Then you cut them off with your neck turner, and now you're consistent. So then you can size it back down with your bushing, and it should be as consistent as a mandrel at that point. The only thing is, buying bushings, bushing die, and all that stuff is more expensive. So you can go that route if you want. More power to you. I have nothing against that. It works fine. You just need to kind of take all those things into consideration if you're doing it. I found this method works. Like I said, I've used the bushing dies before. I have them specifically even for 308, and here I am using this setup because, like I said, I found it works best. If it didn't work best, I'd use my higher end, high dollar that is, dies, and I'm not. So take that for what you will. So I think that's, I wrote a little bit more here, but that's the gist of it. So yep, I've cleaned them all up, and then the next step would be to run them through the dry tumbler and remove all this lube, because now it's all sticky. But for the video's sake, I'm going to skip that step. And so anyways, let's pretend that we did. Once they're all, once they're all dry and cleaned up from the dry tumbler, then we'll go into trimming. We'll trim, chamfer, and deburr. So I just recently picked up, let me scooch over the camera so you can see, hopefully. All right, so I recently just picked up this Trim It 2, which is very similar to a Gerard Triway. It trim, chamfers, and deburrs all in one step. So the only difference, the big difference, I guess, in this thing and the Gerard Triways is it has little removable inserts, so you can swap these things out. $20, you can buy a new insert for a different cartridge and switch it over pretty quick with some Allen wrenches and adjust the cutter, and you're running it with a different cutter for $20 rather than another $105 for another whole different setup for a Gerard. That's one of the beauties about this thing. So as you can see, I have this set up in my drill press. They work best around 600 RPMs, and I can control the RPMs with obviously my drill press way easier than anything else. So, and since I have it, I'm going to use it. So I'll go ahead and show you how this thing works. And that was basically the final step on the brass preps here. So let me flip this on. So there, if you can see, is what it looks like when it's done. It's really nice. So anyways, I'm just gonna do 4 there. You can see, maybe you can see that it was definitely a little more challenging to do with lube on there. The cases want to grab a little bit on that cutter, and then when they're lubed, obviously they spin in my hands really easily. So that's why I really like to clean them up before I do that step. That way they're not spinning around on me while I'm trying to trim. So if you don't have something like this, it's not a big deal. Obviously this is not required, but just make sure, however you trim, if you're using a method that leaves burrs and doesn't chamfer, that you do run something like this and give a nice chamfer on the inside, and then run the other end over and get rid of that burr. It's very important that you give yourself a nice chamfer on the insides of your case mounts, because if you don't, and you've just got that straight edge, when you go to seat your bullets, it's going to hit the jacket on the bullet, and it's going to start actually cutting into it and cutting off some of the copper on your jacket. and that's just not conducive to accuracy. So screwing up your bullets, especially when it's inconsistent. So it's probably not going to matter at short ranges. I mean, it might not matter even at long ranges. I can't tell you 100%. I mean, there's always lots of variables at play. It's hard to pinpoint one thing down to what you see on targets. So all I know is it's easily prevented by putting a chamfer in there. So that's what I would highly recommend, and that's what I do is just to put a chamfer in there, so that way you're essentially creating a funnel at the top of that case for that bullet to go down into nice and easy without stripping any of the copper off the jacket. So anyways, once they are all trimmed up and chamfered and deburred there, you're pretty much done. And the only thing left at that point is to sort them out. So since these were all from the same batch, I will just keep these together, and as I fire some thunder there, that was really close. Anyways, once those are all I'll keep those sorted. Once I fire the other 80, I'll just keep those together. I'll put these together and reload all 100s of those all up again. So if you're running, let me get my train of thought again. Apologize. If you're just using any old brass that you haven't fired before, again, I would recommend that you sort those out by weight or however. That way you're ensuring that the case capacity and all that stuff is as close together as possible. That's just going to give you better pressures and better consistent muzzle velocities and stuff like that. So however you decide to do that, that's kind of your decision. But and if you're using brass like Peterson, Lapua, Alpha, Starline even, I mean, they're all really consistent. You can pretty much, as long as you keep them in the same lot, you probably don't even need to worry about sorting them like that. If you're using Peterson and Lapua and all those, annealing's not something you need to do right away or all the time. They do a good job on that. So if you don't have an annealer, you don't have to go out and buy one right away. I have it, I do it, so I'm showing you that. I would recommend it for ultimate consistency. It's not absolutely required. All right, so wrapping up here, this is basically the end of how I prep my fired brass. So like I said, last step is to sort them out and make sure everything is consistent, and then we're done. So I'll do a part 2 here next. Stay tuned for that, and I'm going to show you exactly how I prep these from new. And again, as always, feel free to ask questions in the comments and provide any feedback you might have. And thanks again for watching. See you.